everybody, it's Sarah, and today I am back with a review, and that review is going to be full of very conflicting thoughts because the book that I'm going to be reviewing today is The First Binding by R.R. Verdi, which is the first book in the Books of Tremaine series. So as always, my reviews are spoiler free, so this one will be no exception there. However, I will structure this review a little bit differently than usual because usually I go from negative thoughts to positive thoughts. With this one, I kind of want to split it into the different sections or parts of the book, which will make sense once I start reviewing. But first, let's talk about what this is even about. In this story, we follow Ari. Ari is a storyteller and he is, or seems to be, on a mission. However, while one night he's performing in a tavern in this town, he meets a singer and he is very enchanted by the singer. The two of them kind of seem to hit it off, and she convinces him to tell his life story to her. And so within the story you kind of get the framing chapters, which are Ari and the singer interacting, Ari in the present, and also Eloane, who is the singer. You kind of get chapters about her, and then you also get the majority of the book, which is Ari's life story from his youth to, in this book we follow him to his I would say late teens, early teens, late teens, somewhere around there. So that summary of this book might have sounded familiar, even though I left out one detail, which is that a big chunk of this story is set in a school for magic and Ari trying to learn the specific magic of this world. And the reason for that is, well, if you were reminded of a story by that, you probably were reminded of the Kingkiller Chronicles by Patrick Rothfuss. That is not chance. The author himself did say he was very inspired or influenced by the Kingkiller Chronicles, which is his favorite book series or unfinished book series, or one of his favorites. And I believe, if I remember correctly, one of the things that he did say as well is he kind of wanted to take that story but wanted to tell it with a South Asian influence. So this story very much is a case like The Wheel of Time or something, where authors are very inspired by a book that has by now become a classic within a genre. However, they want to take that story again and kind of put their own twist on that same story. So I will also, in parts of this review, compare this book to the Kingkiller Chronicles, which is something that I usually don't like to do because it's a whole thing that Book Twitter and Book Talk and the Booksternet spheres do, where they take books and stories by BIPOC authors, if they even so much in just one tiny element or trope resemble a book by a white fantasy author, and then say it's completely ripped off, yada yada, whatever. So I'm not really a fan of doing that usually. However, since the author himself did come out and very publicly say that, you know, this book does take a lot of influence from that other story, I kind of feel like I can talk about the comparisons between the two books and where the two books are similar, where maybe this book falls short, and also some other things that maybe this book does better than the Kingkiller Chronicles. But obviously I will also talk about this book as its own story. However, I do want to start with the comparison bits. So when it comes to being in comparison to Kingkiller, this book starts with, in my opinion, one big mistake. And that is that within its prologue already, if you have read the Kingkiller Chronicles, it starts in a way that, in my opinion, consciously calls attention to, okay, this is going to be its own take on the Kingkiller Chronicles. However, by doing that on the very first page, it also invites comparisons already on the very first page. And it invites comparisons in one specific sense where this book, I am sorry to say, just can't hold up. And that is the writing. No matter what else you can say about the Kingkiller Chronicles, I can't really say that much about the story anymore in general because I haven't read the full Kingkiller Chronicles in a while, in a few years. it's been almost 10 years, to be honest. However, the thing that is stand out about Patrick Rothfuss, and you can ask almost anyone about that and they will agree, is his writing. His mastery over words has like almost no competition within the fantasy genre. And so for me, when I started this book and when I was so instantly reminded of the Kingkiller Chronicles, whether it was fair or it was not, I just automatically tried to compare the writing, and in that regard this book just very much falls short. I would even say at the beginning of the story, like this story takes some time to get into its own voice, I would say. Maybe it was just that it took me to get used to the writing, or it was that the author had to get used to writing. It's kind of hard to tell if it's one or the other sometimes. But the first like 100 to 200 pages, the writing to me was very clunky. It was better done than a lot of other stories that I've read, but like it wasn't bad in any way. But for me, the writing felt like the author hadn't quite found his voice yet, and like he was writing in a voice that was not his own. And because of that, I was just constantly reminded that I was reading a book and reading a story, and it wasn't really possible for me to immerse myself into the story. However, as I mentioned, I did get into the writing, or the author got into the writing, the author found his voice, whatever it may be, but I didn't have that issue anymore later on in the book. In terms of other comparisons to Kingkiller, there are quite a few scenes that were quite reminiscent of Kingkiller for me, especially later on in the magic school thing, but I'm not quite sure if it was just specifically reminiscent of Kingkiller for me, because once again, there is this comparison between the two books. There are quite often callbacks, or if it just was the use of general common tropes in similar settings to this one, and because Kingkiller was, you know, so close in my brain, I just automatically compared it to Kingkiller all the time. I will say though, there were very few scenes that I would say, as far as I remember, once again it's been a while since I read Kingkiller, that would be a direct copy of any of the scenes in Kingkiller. It's just, you know, some of the system, some of the backstory seemed very familiar, but they also weren't things where I wouldn't say, okay, I've seen them somewhere else in fantasy as well. So it's kind of this weird in-between thing. The thing where I would say this book did do better than Kingkiller, although still not quite 100% so good that I'm not worrying about something very specific, is both stories have a framing device and then the story that is told. And also with both stories, you have the framing device and there's something happening in the framing device that seems to be very important, but then you also have, you know, the normal story, and that's progressing along. I don't know how many books this is going to be, by the way, if it's gonna be 3 books or whatever. There is going to be the second book published that's gonna be published this year, I think in October or something. But anyway, with Kingkiller, like from the very first book, there was this worry for me that the stuff that's happening in the framing device, we're not spending enough time in the framing device to ever get to a solution there, or, you know, to get to an ending there. And it just feels like it's worrying to me. I think it might be part of the reason why the third book is taking so long as well, because there's this story that needs to be wrapped up in the framing device. However, we haven't spent enough time in the framing device to even properly set up what's happening. Here, I think the stuff that is happening in the framing device is already set up way better. If it's just a trilogy, I still don't know if there's enough time to properly flesh out that story. However, I worry a lot less about that stuff in here. And kind of the same is the case with the life story of our main character. In here, I feel we're making way faster progressions than in the Kingkiller story or in Name of the Wind and Wise Man's Fear, although even here I feel like we haven't gotten as far as we probably should have. And yeah, there's just some things. Also, I'm gonna put this down because this book is fucking heavy. So aside from the stuff that is comparisons to Kingkiller, what did I enjoy about this book? What did I not enjoy about this book? First, I kind of want to talk about the framing story, which kind of is in 2 parts. First, you have the stuff that is told by Ari, which is also in first-person narration. So you have Ari's life story and Ari's framing parts story that are both in first person. And then you also have like a handful of chapters that are from the woman's point of view, Eloane, and those are told not just in third person but also in present tense. And this is where my, I would say, biggest issue with the story comes in, because this author very obviously put a lot of thought into how he wanted to set up his story. And when you think about setting up a story, narration is very important. Which narration style do you choose? And a lot of authors, at least in my opinion, don't really spend a lot of time thinking about that. Like, a lot of authors will just use multiple first-person POVs, not thinking what the implications behind that might be. Why would they do that? Why do they want to choose that? Some authors just, you know, use first-person narration because, for example, a lot of YA fantasy is told in first-person narration. But why specifically do you want to choose first-person narration? What are the benefits or the drawbacks compared to third-person narration? What are the implications towards your reader if you choose a certain narration style? And so my issues with the way the narration was done in this one is that by choosing different forms of narration and by choosing certain types of narration, the author does show that he considered what the implications might be. However, it felt like he didn't think the thought to the end, because you have things like, you have Eloane's chapters that for some reason, once again, are in present tense, but they're happening at the same time as Ari's framing chapters. So, you know, they are simultaneous. So why is one in present tense? Why is the other not in present tense? That's kind of weird. Then within Eloane's chapters, she is called Eloane, which, that's not a spoiler, it literally happens in the first 3 chapters. That is a name that Ari gives her. It's not her actual name. We never learn her actual name. But by using Eloane as the name that she's called in those chapters, it once again infers that Ari is narrating those chapters, because other people call her by different names. So it's kind of confusing there. Then in terms of Ari's framing story, first person narration, and then also his life story, first person narration, for me in the writing styles there was not quite enough difference there. So I had issues there, and for me those are some very specific problems that I think some people might be able to overlook. But for me, every now and again, there were just chapters that reminded me of these issues that I had, and with the way I noticed them, it just was really hard for me to fully dive into the story. Aside from that, I just in general wasn't really that much of a fan of the framing story. I liked the chapters when Ari was alone. However, I really did not like the dynamic between Ari and Eloane. I thought Eloane was just horrible to him. She's just, I don't know, I think she's supposed to seem strong and mysterious, but really she just comes off as really gaslighty, aloof, and a bully, kind of, not gonna lie. And there was supposed to be this chemistry between the two of them, but for me it just felt forced. And a lot of times it just didn't make sense why Ari reacted to Eloane the way she did, especially with the things that she did to him, which she does quite a few shitty things. And yeah, it just did not work for me. Luckily, the framing stuff is the least part of the story. I think overall it's like a quarter of the story, and most of the story is Ari's backstory. There's also some things with other stories within the story, like every now and again you're told legends, which I did enjoy the legends themselves. With some of them there was some quite interesting things done with language and, you know, with the writing itself. However, I felt like the way that they were used was not quite to my liking, because it didn't always make sense why they were used at a specific point. For me, it would just have helped more if, you know, they had more shown maybe parallels to what was happening in Ari's backstory or something at the time, or if they were set up to what's happening in the next part of the story, or I don't know. They're just, I enjoyed the stories themselves. I didn't enjoy the use of them in the bigger picture or narrative. And also with the stories, I'm very confused about Ari's age. I do not know exactly how old Ari is. Like, is he actually an adult or is he immortal? I'm not quite sure, to be honest. But now let's get to Ari's life story, which, to be honest, I enjoyed the most. And I think that's the part of the book. If it was just about that, I would probably give the book 4 stars. I thought it was really well paced. I didn't always like when we went back to the framing story. I thought that was sometimes done a bit sudden and kind of pulled you out of the story once again. But in terms of just that backstory, I did really enjoy it and I really liked it. And yeah, there's nothing more to say about that. I mean, there's not necessarily that much new in terms of, you know, storytelling, story building, character building in the story. In terms of world building, yes, because this story is South Asian inspired. The author is South Asian. I'm not sure if he's like South Asian American, South Asian British, or South Asian, like if he's diaspora or not. Basically, that's what I'm saying, but it's South Asian inspired. So the world building for me was really interesting and I think that added a lot. But in terms of Ari as a character, I think he's a very comfortable trope. He's kind of the, you know, orphan type trope, and so he goes through a couple of different stages in his life during this book, and I thought that was really interesting, to be honest. I really enjoyed it. I thought Ari is annoying. He's an annoying little shit, like, can't deny, and I think he's a character that might annoy some people to the degree that they might not enjoy the book, because he definitely is the type of character who always knows best and who doesn't listen to other people and who's very driven. But overall, I liked his dynamic with other characters in the story. I liked his dynamic with his teachers in the school. I liked his dynamic with his friends. And yeah, so overall, I did enjoy the story. There were some things that I just was really not happy with, which is why I ended up giving it 3.5 stars instead of 4 stars. However, I think it's a first book that intrigues me, and it's a first book that definitely makes me want to continue on with the series, and that makes me want to see how the author takes this very heavily Kingkiller influenced story in the first book and continues on with it and makes it his own. After all, we also had that with The Wheel of Time. I mean, I personally didn't enjoy The Wheel of Time, but people who read the first book basically are saying it's like Lord of the Rings, The Fellowship of the Ring light, and then it does very much turn into its own story. So I do have the hopes that this will happen with this one as well. And so yeah, that's my thoughts on the first binding. If you have read the book, tell me in the comments down below. If you haven't read it, tell me, are you interested in picking it up? I mean, it is quite a chunky boy. It's 800 pages, but I think especially after the series, I'm actually excited what this author is going to write after he finished this series. But yeah, if you enjoyed this video, maybe think about giving me a thumbs up and also maybe subscribing. All the links to my social media as well as to my book club, a link down below, so go and check those out, and I hope I'll see you very soon. Bye!